Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture for Literature 2090. Today, we're going to do somewhat a brief history of film and cover a couple different concepts that are kind of crucial to literary studies and film studies. And basically, what we're going to deal with is verisimilitude and realism. So, that's going to be kind of the main overarching kind of concepts that we'll be dealing with. So, let's define it, right? So, verisimilitude is truth seeming, right? The quality of a fictional work, whether it's play, novel, short story, film, TV show, whatever, right, of appearing to be true. Not quite the same thing as realism. It's a classical concept that derives from mimesis, right, which is the representation of nature and humanity, right, miming, right, that's where it comes from. It originates from Plato, Aristotle, and it originates from their theories concerning drama. You could find this in Aristotle's Poetics for kind of further reading. And basically, they argue that works should reach to represent only what could be reasonably expected in real life. So even though it's fiction, right, the thing should still at least make sense. The mechanisms within characters, the motivations within characters, the actions of the play or short story or whatever should somewhat make sense. What Coleridge does with this idea is he turns it into the suspension disbelief, basically, and this is a very kind of important guiding force for today's kind of concepts in literature and film studies and so forth. So to define it specifically, it's basically a writer can infuse human interest and a semblance of truth into a fantastic tale. So like something like sci-fi, right? So Star Wars, Harry Potter, Star Trek, right? Anything that's very fantasy based. We could at least still, even if we have crazy worlds, right? The reader would suspend judgment concerning the implausibility of the narrative if the human interest is there, right? If we relate to characters, if we relate to the actions that are happening, something has to be relatable. There has to be some sort of semblance of reality, truth, relatability, and then we could buy, as readers or viewers, fiction. So it's a very important concept, and it is the foundation of basically film because that verisimilitude aspect is really crucial. For literature, verisimilitude again always existed. We're talking about Greek dramas and so forth. So hundreds, thousands of years of literature. What we're focusing on specifically with the kind of increase in verisimilitude and realism for literature really starts with the rise of the novel. So term is around before the genre, but basically the term novel, novella, right, originates in the 1500s. The genre that we know is basically around in the 1700s. So in the neoclassical age, right, which is a return to kind of Roman artistic and philosophical ideas of the 1700s, crucial, of course, for our democracy and so forth. If you're interested in history, you need to kind of understand the neoclassical mindset. Basically, they want to return to Roman artistic, philosophical ideas, aesthetics, and so forth. So what they do is it inspires writers to create long histories and adventures, which we call, of course, novels today, of fictional characters that maintain a high level of verisimilitude. How they do this is usually they write through journals, right? It's usually a lost letter or talk about found footage in film. This is basically found literature. Basically, the story was based on journals, right, that never existed, but for the purpose of the novel, it does. What's called epistolary. Basically, they're writing letters, right, fictional letters, or they're writing fictional diaries. And this is pretty much the start of the novel. So it's kind of a collection of letters, diaries, and so forth. And they're compiled to, like we have for found footage, to seem real, right? So it's an important idea. If you're very interested in literature and this concept, Ian Watt's The Rise of the Novel really explains at great depth why we're so obsessed with kind of verisimilitude. Not the same thing as realism, which we'll get to in a moment, but that's basically what we're dealing with. It's the semblance of truth. Realism itself is an artistic movement that obviously the popularity of the novel, and then, of course, the rise of technologies really kind of creates a great movement in the 1800s, and we still have it today as a huge influencing point. This is presenting as real as possible. So we're not talking about just a semblance of truth or something similar to truth, real as possible. So it's, a trend toward depictions of life, people, society as they are, right? Without any kind of fantastical element. So the difference between just look at like cop shows, right? And versus, space shows, right? There's always going to be a semblance of truth in space shows, but they're going to have to tweak, the technology and so forth because it doesn't exist yet with light speed and all that. Whereas cop shows, they're steeped in realism, right? It's not just steeped in verisimilitude, they're steeped in realism. What realists were doing is they were rebelling against any kind of idealized or romanticized presentations of people and events. They wanted to capture everyday life without ignoring controversial topics, ignoring any kind of taboo subject matter. So you see the rise of characters who are morally ambiguous. You see the rise of prostitutes as main characters, right, which was shocking for people, right? It originates in France after their revolution ends in about 1848, and again, it's to control the truth, right? That it's to present the truth through art as realistic as possible, and that's why I give you both of these images because they really show the realist versus the non-realist, right? So what happens with film and of course literature is the more photographic realism we have, what we call photorealism, the more interest we have in preserving realism and real life as close as possible. So photography starts in the 1820s. It's not a mass art until 1884 when George Eastman develops film to replace photographic plates. And that's the old thing, right, where you have to stand and it takes forever to set up and so forth. And if you've ever seen pictures in movies, or scenes in movies, they have a huge, fire flash basically. So once those things are replaced with actual film, right, it becomes a pop art and a commercial art. So photojournalism becomes super crucial. See events in real life, again, realism that happened, right, or thousands of miles away in totally different countries. So it becomes an important form of media, right? So because of the stunning real life depictions, we of course want that in art, right? And so audiences increasingly demand the real, and then of course artists want to capture the real, and that's why it's one French photograph really shows, right, the kind of interesting dynamic between photography and art, right? You could draw someone's portrait, which would be verisimilitude, right? You could get them as accurately as possible, or you could take an actual picture, which is the real skin tone and the real shadows and real beard and so forth. So the kind of overlap between verisimilitude and realism is crucial to kind of show how film develops, right, throughout the course of the late 19th century and then throughout the 20th and of course now beyond in the 21st. Inventions such as the Kinescope in 1831 and the zoetrope in 1834 initiated the impulse to capture the real in film. So although these devices captured animation, photographic film would appear in about the 1800s, which began the film industry. So what we do is we have devices now that can capture movement, and again, it becomes a really important idea. This horse in motion scientifically was really important because it actually answered the question, do horses' legs actually leave the ground while they were running? So, when we were able to take a bunch of photographs back to back to back and then put them together to form a moving picture, we actually answered a scientific question that, plagued, zoologists and so forth for a while. So the Kinescope, the way that worked with the animation is you would see this kind of rotating disc, and this is from 1893. But basically, as you, the viewer, would see this kind of image. So it's a very kind of interesting dynamic, and again, mostly animation. But what does it do? It captures the real, and I'll post this link for you just to show how even modern artists use zoetropes and so forth. So when we get to the Kinescope, which is 1891, it was a personal viewing machine created in kind of a peep show style viewing, and it worked with photographic images, not just animation. And this is a huge one of the first Kinescope in like motion pictures, as we would call them nowadays, which was the Leonard Cushing bout. And so again, I could be anywhere in the world and I could see a fight that was recorded. Revolutionary technology that again further fueled our need for realism in art. So just to kind of give you a quick background of how things moved. The first public exhibition of projected motion pictures in America was at Coast or in Biel's Music Hall in New York in 1896. The Nickelodeon was the first type of indoor exhibition space dedicated to showing projected motion pictures, usually set up in kind of storefronts, small, simple theaters charged by 5 cents, Nickelodeon, for admission, and flourished from 1905 to 1915. Very quickly, you see a great movement, and I'll post a couple of videos where, early film in the late 1800s was just basic shots, but then very quickly they became, huge productions. And usually with early film, we have single scenes, sometimes staged, sometimes authentic. Usually they're just depicting a sporting event, a public event, sometimes it's slapstick, everyday life in general. There are flat compositions. There's no real cinematic or cinematographic, techniques or camera movements at all. And so really quickly, so the first kind of complete narrative based is 1902, right? So when you think about it just in terms of time, so we have 1896 showing motion pictures that are short, minute clips, 30-second clips. Then we have a narrative based film in, little less than 10 years. And then we have our first feature length film in 4 years after that. So, the technology changes very quickly, but you could see the progression very kind of gradually. Now, in terms of how this works in modern films, where there we get into the uncanny valley idea, and realism becomes something that some people are uncomfortable with versus not comfortable with. And so when we start creating CGI, and again, think about how weird CGI is. We could just film actors in costumes, right? But why do we do CGI? Well, that gets into the idea of verisimilitude and realism, right? We still want animated characters to look as real as possible, but when they look too real or they look off, right, which some of these films had very poor ratings because of their CGI components, right? When they take a actor who's dead, for example, in Rogue One, and try to CGI him into a modern movie, people really were uncomfortable with what they saw. That's the difference between realism and verisimilitude. We still want a semblance of truth a lot of times in our movies, but once we deal with realms that are weird, right, especially animation, we don't want it to look too real because that's odd, but we also don't want it to look too unreal because then we have no relatability. It's a very interesting idea how we blur the lines between verisimilitude and realism, which again still happens today. And so a couple good examples of very successful animated characters would be, of course, Avatar and then Guardians of the Galaxy, where a lot of people didn't mind the kind of more cartoonish characteristics because this is verisimilitude. There's a semblance of reality. But again, think of the raccoon. He's still cartoonish. He's not super ultra realistic, right? And I think that's the balance that modern films kind of have to grapple with when we talk about CGI characters or CGI actors and so forth. Again, Gemini Man and all that, where you de-age actors. A lot of these technological advances, again, just go back to the idea of verisimilitude and realism, where we want to capture the real. But if we do it in a weird way, it's uncomfortable. If we do it in a very nuanced or cartoonish way, a lot of times that is a little bit more comfortable because we still know we're watching animation and we could suspend our disbelief if they don't look too odd, right? And again, the Pokemon movie, Pikachu Detective or whatever that was, all these animated films really hinge on how we feel about verisimilitude and how we feel about realism. So that's, again, huge amounts of time spans, but just to kind of show you just a kind of basic level of where we want to start talking about kind of film and how we translate literature to film and so forth. Obviously, if you have questions, always post them in the forum or email. In the meantime, just good luck finishing up all your tasks this week and take care.